My life is pretty simple, you know. Up before dawn, grabbing a quick coffee and a stale donut from the corner store, then off to wrangle traffic cones and patch potholes for the city. It's honest work, pays the bills, and leaves me with enough energy to walk Buster, my old English bulldog, around the block a couple of times before collapsing into bed. I'm Terrence Miles, a cog in the machine, a face in the crowd, completely unremarkable. Until Karen moved in anyway. She bought the place across the street, a sprawling 2-story Victorian with a freshly manicured lawn and an air of, well, let's just say she looked like she'd swallowed a lemon whole. Within hours of the moving truck pulling up, she was already making her presence known. First, it was the recycling bin. Apparently my placement of it, a mere 6 inches further from the curb than she deemed acceptable, was an affront to the entire neighborhood aesthetic. She cornered me as I was leaving for work, a whirlwind of perfectly coiffed blonde hair and designer sunglasses. To deliver a lecture on civic responsibility and the importance of property values, I mumbled an apology, adjusted the bin, and tried to forget the whole thing. But that was just the opening act. The next day, Animal Control showed up at my door, responding to a complaint about Buster being dangerously large and potentially aggressive. Lester, bless his heart, is about as threatening as a fluffy throw pillow. He's got more rolls than a bakery and spends most of his day snoring on the couch. The Animal Control officer, a weird-looking woman with a name tag that read Brenda, took one look at Buster, stifled a laugh, and assured me he was perfectly fine. She even gave him a treat from her stash before leaving, which promptly earned me a glare from across the street that could curdle milk. From then on, it was a constant barrage of petty grievances. My lawn was too long, it wasn't. My car was too loud, it wasn't a sports car, just a well-maintained pickup, and my choice. Of music when gardening was disturbingly bass-heavy, I was listening to NPR. I tried to ignore her, to chalk it up to neighborhood eccentricity, but it was starting to wear me down. It felt like I was living under a microscope, every action scrutinized, every decision judged. I started avoiding my own front yard, opting to use the back entrance just to avoid a confrontation. I even considered moving, but the thought of uprooting my life because of one, well, you know what she is? It's filled me with a stubborn resentment. This was my home, and I wasn't going to let her drive me out. The morning I got my paycheck started like any other. Alarm clock blaring at an ungodly hour, a quick shower to wake me up, and then the ritualistic trek to the corner store for my caffeine fix. I grabbed the usual, a large black coffee, extra sugar, and a day-old donut that probably cost more than it was worth. As I walked back towards my house, the familiar weight of the sealed envelope in my hand felt comforting. It represented hours of hard work, of sweat and toil, and the small satisfaction of knowing I was contributing to something bigger than myself. As I stepped onto my porch, there she was. Karen, standing on her own porch, arms crossed, her gaze fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. She looked like a predator sizing up its prey, and I suddenly felt a surge of unease. I tried to ignore her, to pretend she wasn't there. But her voice, shrill and demanding, cut through the morning air like a rusty saw. "Excuse me?" she called out, her voice dripping with condescension. "Is that your paycheck?" I hesitated. For a moment, debating whether to even acknowledge her. But her stare was unrelenting, and I knew she wouldn't let it go. "Yeah, it is," I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. "What's it to you?" Her eyes narrowed, and she took a step closer to the edge of her lawn. "I was just wondering how much you make," she said, her voice laced with a strange mixture of curiosity and judgment. "It's public record, you know, taxpayer money." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Was she seriously asking me how much I earned? It was none of her business, and I wasn't about to share my personal financial information with the neighborhood. "Busybody," I chuckled nervously, trying to diffuse the situation. "Come on now, Karen," I said, shaking my head. "That's a little personal, don't you think?" I turned to walk towards my front door, hoping she would take the hint and leave me alone. But she wasn't about to let me off that easily. She took a step off her porch and onto my lawn, her expression hardening. "Don't get smart with me," she snapped, her voice rising in volume. "I'm just saying, if you have enough money to drive." That gas-guzzling monstrosity in your driveway, you should be sharing some of it with the struggling folks on this block. My jaw dropped. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Sharing my paycheck with the struggling folks on the block? Was she serious? I glanced at her house, the perfectly manicured lawn, the gleaming luxury SUV parked in the driveway, the constant stream of Amazon packages delivered to her doorstep. Struggling folks, I repeated incredulously. You moved in 3 houses down with a brand new SUV and get deliveries every day. What are you talking about? Her face flushed red, and she took another step closer, invading my personal space. That's beside the point, she retorted, her voice dripping with indignation. The point is, we all have a responsibility to help those less fortunate than ourselves. And if you're making enough money to live comfortably, you should be giving back to the community. I took a deep breath, trying to maintain my composure. I knew that arguing with her would be pointless, but I couldn't let her get away with this blatant entitlement. With all due respect, Karen, I said, my voice firm but polite, what I do with my money is none of your concern. I work hard for every penny I earn, and I'm perfectly capable of deciding how to spend it. I turned to walk towards my front door again, hoping to end the conversation once and for all. But she wasn't finished. She stepped in front of me, blocking my path, her eyes blazing with anger. You think you're so high and mighty, don't you? She sneered. You think you're better than everyone else because you have a job? Well, let me tell you something, buddy. I didn't wait to hear what she had to say. I'd had enough. I stepped around her, unlocked my front door, and went inside, slamming the door behind me. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. I stood in my living room, catching my breath, trying to shake off the lingering feeling of anger and frustration. I peeked through the blinds, watching as Karen stood in my yard, fuming, muttering to herself. I sighed, knowing that this wouldn't be the last I heard from her. I decided to ignore her, hoping she would eventually get bored and go away. I grabbed a glass of water and turned on the television, trying to distract myself. But the image of her angry face kept flashing in my mind. 10 minutes. That's all it took. 10 minutes of relative peace before the flashing red and blue lights erupted outside my window, shattering the quiet of the morning. My heart sank. I knew instinctively that this was Karen's doing. I peeked through the blinds again, and there they were, 2 police officers. Standing on my lawn, talking to Karen, who was now standing by the curb, clutching her chest and sobbing dramatically. It was a performance worthy of an Oscar. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but I could see her gesturing wildly towards my house, her face contorted with a mixture of anger and despair. The officers listened patiently, nodding their heads and taking notes. One of them looked in my direction, his eyes meeting mine through the blinds. He raised an eyebrow, as if to say, "Is this for real?" I shook my head slowly, mouthing the words, "I don't know." After a few minutes, the officers started walking towards my house. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was about to come. I opened the door before they could knock, hoping to get ahead of the situation. "Good morning, officers," I said, trying to sound calm and collected. "What seems to be the problem?" One of the officers, a young man with a neatly trimmed mustache, stepped forward. "Mr. Miles?" he asked, his voice polite but firm. "We received a call from Ms. Henderson regarding a disturbance. She claims that you stole money from her and threatened her with a financial document." I stared at him in disbelief. Stole money from her? Aggressively threatened her with a financial document. This was beyond ridiculous. Couldn't believe. She was actually trying to get me arrested. "That's absurd," I replied, shaking my head. "I didn't steal anything from her. I certainly didn't threaten her with anything." I held up the sealed envelope containing my paycheck. "This is my paycheck," I explained. "I was simply walking to the bank when she confronted me and demanded that I share my money with her. I refused, and she got angry. That's all there is to it." The officers exchanged glances. The older officer, a grizzled veteran with a weary expression, spoke up. "Ms. Henderson claims that you physically intimidated her and made her fear for her safety," he said, his voice skeptical. I just stared at him, dumbfounded. "Physical intimidation? I'm a man of average build, and Karen could probably bench press me." "Officer," I said, trying to keep the exasperation out of my voice, "I assure you, The only thing I intimidated was her sense of reality. She came onto my property, demanded money, and when I refused, she decided to call you. To extort it through legal means. This is harassment, plain and simple. I held out the envelope. Here's the so-called financial document she claims I threatened her with. Still sealed. Haven't even seen the digits myself yet. The young officer stepped forward. Sir, with your permission, we'd like to ask a few more questions. I sighed internally. This was going to take a while. All right, officers, I said, stepping back to allow them entry. But I want to make something clear. This is a complete waste of your time and resources. Once inside, I offered them a seat at my kitchen table. The young officer started taking notes as the older one began his questioning. He asked about my job, my relationship with Karen, and the details of the encounter that morning. I answered truthfully and concisely. Trying to remain calm and collected, I emphasized that I had never touched Karen, never threatened her, and never stolen anything from her. I explained that she had been harassing me since she moved into the neighborhood, and that this was just the latest escalation. About this financial document, Mr. Miles? The older officer asked, gesturing towards the envelope still sitting on the table. Ms. Henderson seemed quite adamant that it played a significant role in the alleged incident. I smirked. Officer, that's my paycheck. It's sealed, as you can see. She asked how much I made. I told her it wasn't her business, and she lost it. That's the whole story. Then I remembered. Actually, I said, a glimmer of hope in my voice. I have a doorbell camera. It recorded the whole thing. I led them to the living room and pulled up the footage on my phone. There it was, in crystal clear detail. Karen marching across my lawn, confronting me, demanding money, and then, after I went inside, her melodramatic performance on the curb. The officers watched it in silence, their expressions slowly changing from skeptical to, well, something approaching disbelief. When the footage ended, the young officer let out a low whistle. Wow, he said, that changes things. The older officer nodded grimly. Indeed it does. He pulled out his radio. Dispatch, this is Officer Miller. We need backup at my address. Possible false report and other potential charges. The air crackled with tension as the officer radioed for backup. I felt a surge of relief wash over me. Finally, someone was taking me seriously. Finally, Karen's reign of terror was coming to an end. While we waited for the other officers to arrive, the two officers on the scene pulled Karen aside for questioning. I could hear her voice rising and falling in a dramatic crescendo as she tried to explain her side of the story. She was talking about taxes, fairness, and economic justice, but her words sounded hollow and unconvincing. The officers weren't buying it. They asked her pointed questions, challenging her inconsistencies, and slowly but surely, her carefully constructed narrative began to crumble. Within minutes, another police cruiser arrived, sirens blaring. Two more officers emerged, their expressions serious and focused. They joined the interrogation, and the pressure on Karen intensified. I watched from my living room window, a sense of grim satisfaction washing over me. She was finally being held accountable for her actions. After what felt like an eternity, the officers approached Karen. They spoke to her in low voices, and I could see her face contorting with a mixture of anger, fear, and humiliation. Then, they did something I hadn't expected. They handcuffed her. Her eyes widened in disbelief, and she started screaming, protesting her innocence, and accusing me of all sorts of heinous crimes. But it was no use. The officers led her to the back of the police cruiser, her protests echoing through the quiet neighborhood. As the cruiser pulled away, Karen turned her head and glared at me, her eyes filled with pure hatred. Met her gaze, unflinching. I had done nothing wrong, and I wasn't going to be intimidated by her anymore. The remaining officers thanked me for my cooperation and explained that Karen was being charged with filing a false police report and attempting to coerce money from me. They also informed me that she had a history of similar incidents in other neighborhoods. Apparently, this wasn't her first rodeo. After they left, I closed the door and leaned against it, letting out a long sigh of relief. It was finally over, or so I thought. The next day I received a call from my city's transportation department informing me that a formal complaint was made against me, alleging I used city resources to harass a neighbor. I went through the formal process and proved that I was being falsely accused. And that's when I decided to install cameras all around my perimeter of my property, including the backyard. After that day, Karen was never seen again. Said that she was taking time to reflect at a private facility. Some neighbors jokingly said that she was in a place with padded walls. I just shrugged my shoulders and continued doing my job. The best thing to come of it? Buster got extra treats from the neighbors who knew what Karen had done.